The secret story behind Billy the Kid's life and death. What was Billy the Kid's real name? How did he really die? His trail twists through missing records and sharp rumors. Names change, numbers swell, and jail doors somehow open. A sheriff turns from drinking companion to hunter. A grave shifts and floods while old men claim his face. Even modern DNA waits behind courtroom doors. We'll follow the clues from tenements to cattle towns and listen for the truth beneath the legend. The answers will likely surprise you. Don't worry, you'll get them at the end of this video. Don't miss a single part. Who was Billy before he became the Kid? That simple question opens a maze of papers that burned, names that changed, and memories that never lined up. Have you ever tried to trace a family line and found only smudges and guesses? That is what we face here. By the end of this part, you will have a clear, reasonable answer and a few sharp theories that keep the legend alive. Most historians settle on Henry McCarty as the birth name, with a date near 1860 and a crowded start in Manhattan. Picture narrow streets, tenement rooms, and Irish voices trying to get by. His mother, Catherine McCarty, worked and moved and fought to keep her boys afloat. That is the stable center in a world that kept shifting. The rest gets messy fast. No official birth paper survives, which gives rumor plenty of room to run. New York lost records to fires, floods, and office moves. Churches kept ledgers until they did not. Some closed, some merged, and some burned. When the paper trail breaks, stories grow to fill the gap. People love a mystery, and this one paid in headlines. Catherine drifted west for air and hope, stopping in Indiana, Kansas, and finally New Mexico. There she met a miner named William Antrim and married him in 1873. Have you ever taken a new last name because life demanded it? Her boys soon answered to Kid Antrim around town. From that point on, the name stack rose like cards in a windy yard. The father question sounds simple, but stands on sand. Some say the father was Patrick or Michael McCarty, lost to illness or work. Others bring up a Bonnie relative who helped and then vanished. A few point to a sailor named Bonnie from Brooklyn, a man who never got to raise his son. None of these claims sit on solid documents. All of them lean on late memory. So where did William H. Bonnie come from? The alias blooms in his late teens, just as small crimes and big choices arrive. A fresh name reads cleaner on a warrant and neater in a newspaper. It signals a second start to people who never knew the first. Bonnie also sounds firm and respectable, like a man who owns a coat and a plan. That mattered on the frontier. On the New Mexico range, identity could bend without breaking. Cowhands borrowed names to dodge a debt or a grudge. Gamblers did the same when a streak ended badly. Courts tracked faces more than family lines, and bilingual towns turned William into Guillermo and back again without blinking. In that fluid world, the simple nickname won. He was the Kid because he looked young, moved quick, and smiled at trouble. Early school notes describe a bright, polite boy who liked to read, sing, and tell jokes. Friends later said he learned fast and kept his temper light until he could not. Hunger pressed him early, and small thefts followed. The West cheered nerve but punished it when it crossed the wrong man. Do you see how a shifting name could protect a shifting life? That is survival on hard ground. Now for the first hot theory. Some argue that Bonnie was the birth name and Henry came later. They suggest a Bonnie father died young, while Catherine kept the McCarty name to blend in. Supporters point to scribbles on an old tintype and a few family tales that surfaced decades after the fact. It sounds tidy. It also rests on thin ice. The sources arrive too late and lean too hard on hearsay. The second bold claim says he started as Patrick Henry McCarty, born in Ireland and carried across the ocean as a small child. Families hid Irish roots when bias closed doors. No Irish need apply was not just a slogan. In this telling, Catherine used Henry in America and left Patrick behind. The feel of the story fits the times, but fitting is not proof. Without a parish page, it stays a maybe. A third trail jumps to Missouri and ties him to a Bonnie cousin. It relies on old-timers who swore they remembered a boy with fast hands and the same smile. Memory has charm, and it can also drift. When men grow old, the famous face often replaces the forgotten neighbor. This theory keeps appearing because it is colorful. It also lacks the one thing we need, which is early paperwork. What do the strongest papers say? Court dockets, wanted posters, and jail logs use William H. Bonnie and call him the Kid. That is the public mask he wore when trouble got loud. Witnesses who met him at gun range or courtroom distance echoed the same label. The adult world met the alias, and the alias stuck. Newspapers repeated it because short names sell ink. Private moments tell a quieter tale. Letters from his brother Joseph use Henry. Friends from earlier stops used Henry. School notes signed by Catherine point to Henry. Inside the small circle, the boy stayed Henry. Outside, the man became Bonnie. Have you ever had a family nickname and a work name at the same time? That is the idea here, lived out on a harsher stage. Why fight so hard over a label? Because names set tone. Henry sounds like a boy in a rough town. William H. Bonney sounds like a man who measures his words and plays to win. The Kid reads like theater, which is exactly what the dime novels needed. Reporters and novelists built a brand, and that brand fed the legend that still pays for tours and books. Simple sells, even when truth is not simple. Here is the sober part that keeps our feet on the ground. The frontier kept poor files, while counties moved lines and churches lost logs. Editors rushed and copied each other. Clerks quit. Floods and fires did the rest. Add fear of outlaws and fast hearsay, and the record curls like paper near a stove. We must learn from what survives and hold back where it does not. So what is the most reasonable answer today? He was born as Henry McCarty to Catherine, with a father still uncertain. He gained a stepfather in William Antrim, which added Kid Antrim to the pile. He chose the name William H. Bonney when a fresh start and a sharper public look helped him move and survive. He lived in a time and place where that kind of shift felt normal. Do you notice the pattern? First came the need for shelter and safety. Then came the need for standing and edge. Names helped with both, like a coat you changed to suit the weather. McCarty tied him to family. Antrim tied him to a roof. Bonney tied him to control. The Kid tied him to legend. All four threads pulled the same life across the same hard land. Here is the clear take I promised at the start. If you ask for one line, it is this. He was Henry by birth, Bonney by choice, and the Kid by story. That blend fits the best facts we have while leaving room for the unsolved parts we may never fill. It keeps faith with evidence and explains the noise. It also respects why people still argue about a boy who learned to rename himself and keep walking. One more question hangs in the air, and it points to our next part. If the name was a mask, did the legend also inflate the numbers that chased him? People say he killed 21 men, one for each year. Others swear the real count was far lower. Later in this video, we will test each claim and separate tall tale from hard ground. The count starts next, and so does the fight over it. Did Billy the Kid really kill 21 men? One for every year of his short life. That neat, dramatic number shows up in old newspapers, dime novels, and Hollywood movies. But when you pull the legend apart, it begins to unravel. Have you ever noticed how Western stories love numbers that sound too perfect? 21 makes for a great headline, but it doesn't match the historical record. By the end of this part, you'll see how many killings can be confirmed, how many are questionable, and why the famous total refuses to die. The first likely killing happened in 1877 at Fort Grant, Arizona Territory. Billy was still a teenager when he got into a fight with a much larger man, a blacksmith named Frank Cahill. Witnesses said Cahill had bullied Billy for months, shoving him around and calling him names. One day, the insults turned into fists, and fists turned into a pistol. Billy fired once, hitting Cahill fatally. Was it self-defense or hot temper? Either way, it was the first time blood on his hands pushed him to run, and that set the pattern for the rest of his life. The Lincoln County War of 1878 brought more deaths, and most of the numbers tied to Billy come from this chaotic conflict. On April 1st, Billy and the regulators ambushed Sheriff William Brady in the street. Brady had sided with the men who killed Billy's friend and employer, John Tunstall. In the ambush, Brady and his deputy George Heineman were gunned down. Did Billy fire the fatal shot? Nobody knows. There were several shooters, bullets flying from every angle, and no clear way to prove who struck whom. Still, Billy's presence in the ambush branded him as a killer in the public eye. Just days later came the shootout at Blazer's Mill with Buckshot Roberts, one of the most dramatic clashes of the war. Roberts was a seasoned fighter who managed to kill Dick Brewer, the regulators' leader, before being shot himself. Some accounts credit Billy with the final shot. Others say another regulator fired it. With everyone firing at once, the truth gets buried under smoke and loyalty. Stories told afterward often placed Billy at the center because his name was the one that sold papers. Two more deaths during the war often get laid at Billy's feet, those of Frank Baker and William Morton, prisoners of the regulators who ended up dead while being escorted. The official story is muddy. Were they executed outright or killed while trying to escape? Did Billy personally pull the trigger, or did the whole group act together? No clear testimony survives. What remains is rumor, which is enough for legend builders, but not for careful history. By 1880, Billy's reputation was spreading far beyond New Mexico, and that's when the story of Joe Grant surfaced. Grant supposedly tried to kill Billy in a Fort Sumner saloon, but Billy, noticing the gun's cylinder wasn't set properly, spun it so the first chamber was empty. When Grant pulled the trigger, the gun clicked, and Billy fired back, killing him. It's a perfect story of quick wit and quicker reflexes, and it has been retold countless times. But the details line up too neatly, almost like a parable. Was it exactly that smooth, or has time polished it into folklore? The truth is probably less cinematic. The last two killings tied firmly to Billy came in April 1881 during his legendary jailbreak at Lincoln. Deputy James Bell was shot in the courthouse stairwell as Billy made his move. Moments later, Deputy Bob Ollinger came running, and Billy killed him with Ollinger's own shotgun. These two deaths are well documented and witnessed. Even historians who doubt the larger tally agree that Billy killed Bell and Ollinger with his own hands. These were not stories. These were facts written in blood. So, let's count. If you take only the solid, confirmed cases, Cahill, possibly Brady, maybe Buckshot Roberts, and definitely Bell and Ollinger, you get a number between 4 and 6. If you include the ambiguous deaths during the Lincoln County War, you might push it to 8 or 9. But to reach 21, you'd have to give Billy credit for every killing by his gang, every rumor whispered in a bar, and every newspaper exaggeration that treated him as the sole villain in a war filled with shooters. That isn't history, it's myth-making. Why did the inflated numbers stick? Because numbers tell a clean story. 1 year of life, 1 man killed, makes for poetic symmetry, and editors knew it. It was easy to print, easy to repeat, and it turned Billy from a scrappy outlaw into a larger-than-life figure. Politicians also had reason to inflate the body count. If Billy was a one-man death machine, then killing him, or capturing him, sounded like a triumph for law and order. The higher the tally, the more heroic Pat Garrett and the authorities looked. Here's a controversial idea that some historians and old-timers have raised. Not only was the number inflated, but many killings attributed to Billy might have belonged to other men entirely. In group fights, shots came from every direction, but it was Billy who got the credit, simply because he was the most famous face. Fame can make you a hero, but it can also make you a scapegoat. The kid became both, depending on who told the story. Another sharp theory suggests the reason his body count looks lower than expected isn't because he was soft-hearted. It's because he was smart. Billy avoided open duels when he could. He preferred angles, ambushes, and fast getaways. In a real fight for survival, you don't stand in the street at high noon. You strike when you have the advantage, or you don't strike at all. That kept him alive longer than anyone expected, and it explains why many of the killings pinned on him lack witnesses or clear detail. The survivor's way is the quiet way, not the flashy one. So what's the truth? Billy the Kid did not kill 21 men. The most reasonable number sits between 4 and 9, depending on how much weight you give to conflicting accounts from the Lincoln County War. The neat headline total was invented by reporters and novelists, and it has stuck because it's easy to remember. If someone quotes 21 to you, ask for names and dates. Watch how quickly the certainty fades. But don't mistake a lower body count for a smaller legend. If anything, the fact that his real number was lower makes him more interesting. Billy's fame didn't come from stacking bodies like cordwood. It came from his ability to survive, to charm, and to slip through nets that should have caught him. His story is less about how many men he killed, and more about how many times he escaped being killed himself. And that leads us directly into the next part of our journey. Because if the body count was inflated, the escape stories were not. He broke out of jails in ways that shocked the public and embarrassed the law. The numbers may be foggy, but the escapes were spectacular. So next, We'll walk step by step through the jailbreaks that made Billy the Kid a national headline. And we'll ask the same question the lawmen of New Mexico kept asking. How did he keep slipping away? Was Billy the Kid a ghost slipping through iron bars, or just a young outlaw with perfect timing? That question has fascinated storytellers for more than a century. Every time he escaped, the legend grew bigger, until people could hardly separate fact from fiction. Have you ever felt trapped and wished you could slip out unnoticed? Billy lived that feeling, and unlike most men, he found a way out, again and again. Today, let's peel back the layers of his escape stories and see what really happened, and what was just done novel drama. His first known jailbreak happened in Silver City when he was barely a teenager. The charge was minor, a prank that turned into a petty theft, but it earned him a cell with an adobe chimney that wasn't built to hold a wiry kid like him. Within hours he was gone, climbing straight up the chimney and vanishing into the night. Was it sheer nerve or just luck that the jail was so poorly made? Some say a guard looked the other way. Others whisper that a small bribe was involved. What we do know is that Billy walked out of that first cage with the knowledge that walls were only as strong as the people guarding them. The pattern repeated at Fort Grant in 1877 after the fatal fight with blacksmith Frank Cale. Facing possible hanging, Billy slipped free before his captors even knew what had happened. The details blur. Was it an unlocked window, a distracted guard, or help from a cook who liked him? Nobody can say for sure. What's clear is that the young man was already building a reputation as someone who couldn't be held for long. That reputation followed him for the rest of his short life. Then came the Lincoln County War, a feud so bloody and chaotic that it made Billy famous. Arrests and skirmishes piled up, and so did the escapes. At the siege of the McSween house, where fire and gun smoke filled the night, survivors swore Billy walked out wrapped in a blanket like a ghost. Others claimed he shot his way through a burning corridor. Either way, he escaped when dozens of men around him did not. The legend of the boy who could not be caught was gaining strength. But the escape that cemented his legend came later, in April 1881, in the town of Lincoln. Billy had been captured by Sheriff Pat Garrett, sentenced to hang, and was chained inside the courthouse. The date of execution was set for May 13th. On April 28th, everything changed. Deputy James Bell led Billy downstairs, maybe a little too casually, and in the tight stairwell a gunshot echoed. Bell staggered and died. How did Billy get the pistol? Some believe he wrestled it away in a struggle. Others insist a friend smuggled one into the jail, hidden in food or slipped under a coat. Still others hint at an inside job, a guard who quietly left the odds in Billy's favor. The truth remains uncertain, but Billy now had a gun and the upper hand. He sprinted back upstairs, broke his leg irons using a piece of heavy iron as a lever, and seized a shotgun that belonged to Deputy Bob Ollinger. Ollinger heard the shot and came running, only to be greeted by the kid pointing his own weapon at him. Legend says Billy called out, "Hello, Bob," before firing both barrels and killing him instantly. Did he really deliver that perfect one-liner, or was it a novelist's invention? The line fits too neatly, too dramatically, to be trusted. Yet it stuck, and it is still quoted today. You may have heard that he danced a jig on the balcony after the killing. Some claim townsfolk even cheered as he waved to them. But many historians argue that he was simply catching his breath and trying to cut the rest of his shackles loose. A playful jig fits the myth, but in reality, a man in irons who had just killed 2 deputies was not celebrating. He was surviving. Still, the story of the kid who danced after a jailbreak was too good for newspapers to pass up. Inside help remains one of the most controversial theories. Did someone on Garrett's staff quietly favor Billy and make sure the restraints were loose, the watches sloppy, or the weapons close at hand? Ollinger was known as a bully. Bell was new and inexperienced. In a small town where loyalties shifted with the wind, it's not hard to believe that at least one man wanted to see Billy slip away, if only to spite Garrett's deputies. Then again, if Garrett had truly staged the escape, as some claim, he risked losing everything if Billy vanished forever. Garrett's own writings reject the idea, but suspicion has clung to the story ever since. The jail itself didn't help. It was an old, patched-together county building with weak locks and doors that had been repaired more times than recorded. Keys were scattered across years of administrations. Security was casual in a place where money and manpower were scarce. A clever, Observant prisoner like Billy could spot weaknesses and plan around them. He watched routines, listened to guards, and stored away details until the day came to use them. That was not luck, that was preparation. His small size and easy charm also played a role. Billy was not a hulking outlaw who drew constant suspicion. He was wiry, friendly, often smiling, and he spoke fluent Spanish, which let him build quiet networks with local families. A warning whispered by a ranch hand or a meal shared by a sympathetic woman could mean the difference between capture and escape. He didn't just run through doors. He built escape routes with people's trust, long before the moment came to act. So was Billy the Kid really an escape artist beyond belief? The truth is simpler and sharper. He was quick, observant, and bold enough to act when others froze. He studied people, mapped his surroundings, and took advantage of every weakness. His greatest escape, the Lincoln jailbreak, was both deadly and brilliant, and it sealed his reputation as a man no jail could hold. The legend grew because the core story was already incredible, even without the added polish of taunts and jigs. Why do the embellishments still matter today? Because people prefer a story that sings. They want the kid dancing under the sun, calling out clever lines as his enemies fall. Reality is less polished, but no less powerful. What he did was enough. He killed 2 armed guards, broke his chains, and rode out of town while everyone stood frozen. That needs no exaggeration. So here's the clear conclusion. Billy the Kid was not superhuman, but he was a master of timing, nerve, and observation. His escapes weren't miracles. They were the product of a restless, clever mind that refused to be caged. And yet, those escapes also set up the final act of his story, because one man was determined to catch him and end the legend for good. That man was Pat Garrett. And their complicated relationship, half respect, half betrayal, is the next part of our journey. Were Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett really sworn enemies? Or was their relationship more complicated? That question has haunted the story ever since Garrett pulled the trigger in Fort Sumner. Some describe Garrett as a cold-blooded lawman who hunted Billy like an animal. Others whisper that the 2 men knew each other well, maybe even shared meals, jokes, and a certain respect before fate put them on opposite sides. Have you ever lost a friend to politics or business where loyalty gave way to duty? That may be the hidden truth behind their final meeting. Let's start with what we know for sure. Pat Garrett was a tall, ambitious Texan who drifted into New Mexico just like Billy did. He worked as a buffalo hunter, bartender, and gambler before wearing a badge. By the late 1870s, he was known as steady, tough, and willing to enforce the law if it paid well. Billy, meanwhile, was fast becoming the most notorious young outlaw in the territory. Their paths crossed not in a dusty duel, but in the social circles of Lincoln County. Both men drank in the same saloons, gambled in the same halls, and moved in the same company. Did they actually know each other personally before Garrett became sheriff? The evidence says yes. Stories place them at card games together in Fort Sumner. Some claim Billy even loaned Garrett a few dollars when the future sheriff was broke. Others say Garrett admired Billy's quick humor and dancing, and Billy respected Garrett's size and self-control. It's not impossible that the 2 men saw themselves as survivors cut from similar cloth. Both were drifters making their way in a hard land, each depending on wit and nerve. So what changed? Politics, plain and simple. Lincoln County was still bleeding from the war, and the cattle barons who had replaced the old mercantile bosses wanted stability. Billy's raids on herds, his open defiance of warrants, and his easy escape from jail made him a public embarrassment. When Pat Garrett ran for sheriff in 1880, he ran on one promise: to capture or kill Billy the Kid. Winning meant not just enforcing law, but pleasing powerful men who wanted the outlaw problem solved. Garrett took the job, and with it, he took on Billy as his personal test. Did Garrett betray a friend? Some old-timers swore that's exactly how Billy saw it. Imagine being hunted by a man you once sat across the card table from. Wouldn't you feel that sting of betrayal? At the same time, Garrett could argue that Billy had left him no choice. Billy was not just a dancing cowboy with a mischievous grin. He was a wanted fugitive accused of murder, and Garrett's reputation depended on bringing him in. For Garrett, the Kid wasn't just an outlaw. He was the path to legitimacy and power. But here's where the controversy sparks. Some believe Garrett and Billy had a secret agreement, a kind of gentleman's understanding. Garrett would arrest him when the heat was high, then look the other way when Billy managed an escape. That pattern certainly seemed to play out. Billy slipped out of jails too easily, and Garrett's captures always gave the outlaw another chance to shine. Was it sloppy law enforcement? Or was Garrett protecting the legend while still keeping up appearances? We may never know, but the pattern fueled whispers then and fuels theories now. Another hot theory suggests that Garrett almost admired the kid, even as he chased him. In interviews later, Garrett described Billy as fearless, charming, and intelligent. He wrote a book about him, the very first biography of the kid, filled with details only a man who had known him personally could provide. Think about that. How often does a lawman memorialize the very outlaw he was famous for killing? It raises the question, was Garrett preserving the truth or polishing his own legend by attaching it to Billy's name? Their final encounter at Fort Sumner adds even more mystery. Garrett claimed he walked into Pete Maxwell's room, saw Billy in the dark, and shot him point-blank after a brief exchange, yet accounts differ. Some say Billy was unarmed and had no idea Garrett was there. Others say Garrett ambushed him without warning, an act more like an execution than a fair fight. If Garrett had truly respected Billy, why kill him that way? Unless, of course, Garrett feared that giving him another chance would cost him everything: his career, his reputation, and maybe his own life. Have you noticed how the legend paints both men in extremes? Billy becomes the lovable outlaw, and Garrett becomes the cold betrayer. But perhaps the truth is that they were two men caught in a web of politics, duty, and survival. Billy could not stop being Billy, and Garrett could not resist the role history handed him. In a sense, they created each other. Without Billy, Garrett would have been just another small-town sheriff. Without Garrett, Billy might have remained a local nuisance instead of a national myth. Here's the clear take. Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett were not lifelong friends, nor were they simple enemies. Their relationship was a tangle of familiarity, rivalry, and reluctant respect. Garrett may have hunted Billy with determination, but he also helped preserve his memory, ensuring that the kid lived on in stories long after his body fell. It was not just a duel between outlaw and sheriff. It was the collision of two men whose lives became locked together by history. And now that we've seen how their paths crossed and clashed, we come to the darkest and most disputed chapter of all, the night at Fort Sumner, when Garrett pulled the trigger and the kid supposedly died. But did he really? That's the question we face in the next part, where the official story of Billy's death collides with whispers of deception, staged bodies, and the possibility that the kid escaped death itself. Stay tuned, because the story only gets stranger from here. Did Billy the Kid really die in Fort Sumner in 1881, or was the whole thing staged? That single question has fueled more books, arguments, and late-night bar debates than almost any other in Western history. Sheriff Pat Garrett swore he shot Billy in Pete Maxwell's darkened bedroom. Yet from the very start, some locals whispered that the dead man was not the kid at all. Have you ever heard a story that sounded too clean, too convenient? That is what makes this moment so suspicious. Let's go step by step. On the night of July 14th, Garrett and two deputies waited at Maxwell's house. The kid, unaware of the ambush, supposedly entered Maxwell's darkroom looking for beef to eat. He saw a shadow, called out, "Qui-nes? Who is it?" and was answered by the blast of Garrett's revolver. Billy fell dead on the spot, shot through the chest. That is the official version, the one Garrett repeated for the rest of his life. But almost immediately, cracks began to show. For one thing, not everyone who saw the body agreed it was Billy's. Some said the corpse didn't look quite right. The face was swollen, the features hard to recognize in poor light. A few insisted it looked more like Billy Barlow, a drifter who resembled the kid and had been seen around Fort Sumner. Could Garrett have mistaken Barlow for Billy, or worse, knowingly passed off another man's body to claim his reward? Another strange fact, Billy's closest friends were not all convinced. Some swore they saw him alive after 1881. Ranchers and drifters in New Mexico told stories of meeting a man who looked, talked, and rode just like the kid. Was this just wishful thinking, or had Garrett spared his old acquaintance by killing someone else? Remember, Garrett and Billy had known each other. If Garrett wanted the reward, money, and the glory, faking Billy's death with a substitute would give him both without pulling the trigger on a man he respected. The burial adds to the mystery. Billy was supposedly laid to rest in the old Fort Sumner cemetery the next day. Yet the grave was poorly marked, the soil shallow, and no headstone was set until years later. Flooding from the Pecos River washed through the area more than once, scattering bones and destroying records. Today, no one can say for sure where Billy's remains lie, or if they are even still there. That kind of uncertainty is rocket fuel for conspiracy theories. Some historians defend Garrett's account. They argue that too many witnesses confirmed Billy's death for it to be a lie. Maxwell himself was present, and Garrett's deputies swore they saw the body. Newspapers printed the story quickly, and the territory accepted it as fact. But ask yourself, how many of those witnesses were friends of Garrett, or men whose reputations depended on the outlaw being dead? In a world where newspapers thrived on legend, a few signed statements could settle the matter neatly, whether or not they were entirely true. Others point to Garrett's motives. By 1881, he needed a victory. His career, his reputation, even his safety depended on proving that he could bring down Billy the Kid. If the outlaw slipped away again, Garrett would look like a fool, but a quick shot in the dark, with few independent eyes present, gave Garrett exactly what he needed. A dead outlaw, a tidy story, and national headlines calling him a hero. Too tidy, some say. Too convenient. Theories multiply from there. One claim holds that Billy fled south into Mexico, where he lived quietly under another name. Another insists he drifted into Texas and grew old under the name John Miller. But the boldest claim came in the 1940s, when a man named Brushy Bill Roberts stood up in Texas and declared that he was Billy the Kid himself. We will dig into Brushy Bill in the next part, but for now, know this. He only dared to claim the name because so many people already doubted. Garrett's story. Here is what we can say with reason. The official story is that Billy the Kid died at Fort Sumner in July 1881, shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett. That version fit the political needs of the time and gave the public a clean ending to a messy saga. Yet the gaps, the dark room, the questionable body, the unmarked grave, the rumors of lookalikes, leave enough cracks for doubt to seep in. And those cracks never fully closed. They grew wider as decades passed, fueled by eyewitnesses who swore they saw Billy later, and by the mysterious figures who stepped forward claiming to be him. So here is the clear take. If Garrett did kill Billy that night, the evidence was shaky enough to let doubts live on forever. If he did not, then the kid outsmarted not just one sheriff, but all of history. That's why Fort Sumner remains the most contested grave in the American West. And that sets up the next chapter perfectly. Because if Billy didn't die in 1881, then who was the man who turned up in Texas 60 years later, calling himself Brushy Bill Roberts and demanding a pardon? Was he really the kid grown old, or just another imposter chasing a headline? Stay with me, because the survival theories are even stranger than the death story itself. What if Billy the Kid didn't die in 1881 at all? What if he slipped into a new name, lived into old age, and even came back decades later to tell his story? That is the heart of the survival theories, and no version is more famous than the claim of Brushy Bill Roberts. Have you ever heard an old man tell a story so wild you weren't sure whether to laugh or lean closer? That's exactly what happened when Brushy Bill stepped forward in the late 1940s. The story began in Hyco, Texas, where Oliver Brushy Bill Roberts lived as a quiet, aging man. In 1949, he contacted an attorney named William Morrison with an extraordinary claim. He was actually Billy the Kid, still alive nearly 70 years after history said Sheriff Pat Garrett had killed him. Brushy said Garrett never shot him at Fort Sumner. Instead, the sheriff staged the scene, killed another man, and allowed Billy to escape under a new identity. Why would Garrett do such a thing? According to Brushy, Garrett didn't want to kill someone he had once known personally. Letting Billy vanish gave Garrett the glory of killing the outlaw, while sparing him the guilt of shooting an old friend. Does that sound far-fetched? Maybe, but it fit neatly into the long-standing rumors that the body at Fort Sumner had never looked quite right. Brushy Bill's claim shook the West. He didn't just say he was Billy. He wanted something official. A pardon. Back in 1879, New Mexico's Governor Lew Wallace had supposedly promised Billy a full pardon if he testified in the Lincoln County war trials. Billy gave his testimony, but the pardon never came. Now, 6 decades later, Brushy Bill said he had come to collect on that broken promise. The details he shared were startling. He knew the names of obscure regulators from the Lincoln County War. He described places and events in New Mexico that matched old accounts. He carried scars in the right places, even a bullet wound similar to one Billy was rumored to have. He even rode horseback with surprising skill for a man in his 90s, just as Billy was famous for doing in his youth. But skeptics were quick to challenge him. Brushy's age didn't match the record. If he was truly Billy, born around 1860, he would have been in his late 80s, not 90. His speech and memory sometimes wavered, and critics argued that he had simply absorbed the kid's story from books and local lore. After all, Billy was already a legend by the 1940s. Could Brushy have been a devoted fan who convinced himself that he was the man he admired? The state of New Mexico treated his request cautiously. Governor Thomas Mabry even held a meeting where Brushy Bill told his story in front of reporters and officials. But instead of granting a pardon, the governor declared the claim unproven. Humiliated and worn down by the pressure, Brushy Bill Roberts died shortly afterward, collapsing on the street in Hyco in 1950. He never got the pardon he demanded. Yet his story refused to die with him. Some locals in Hyco insist to this day that Brushy was telling the truth. They've built a Billy the Kid museum in town, where his photograph hangs side by side with old images of the kid. Visitors are invited to compare the faces for themselves. Do they match? Some say the resemblance is uncanny. Others insist it's nothing but coincidence. And Brushy Bill wasn't the only one. Other men, like John Miller of Arizona, also claimed to be Billy later in life. Each had a following. Each had inconsistencies, and each added fuel to the theory that Garrett never finished the job. It seems the legend of the kid created shadows where many men could step in and wear the mask. Why does the survival theory matter so much? Because it changes the entire shape of the story. If Billy really escaped Fort Sumner, then the outlaw who supposedly died young became a man who beat both the law and history itself. He would stand as the ultimate trickster, the boy who never grew old in the public's memory but lived quietly in the flesh. For many fans of the legend, that version is far more satisfying than a dark room and a single bullet. So here's the clear take. The survival theories keep the legend alive, and Brushy Bill Roberts remains the boldest and most colorful of them. He had scars, stories, and confidence, but not enough solid evidence to convince the state of New Mexico or the historians who checked his claims. Still, the doubts about Garrett's story gave him just enough space to be believed by some, and enough mystery to keep the tale alive 70 years later. But one more piece of the puzzle remains unsolved, and it might have settled the question once and for all. What about DNA testing? If we could match the remains in Fort Sumner with known descendants of Billy's family, we could prove whether the kid really died in 1881 or not. That's the next part of this journey, and it shows how even science has struggled to put this outlaw's ghost to rest. What if science could finally solve the mystery of Billy the Kid? What if DNA testing could tell us, once and for all, whether Pat Garrett killed him at Fort Sumner or whether the kid walked away to live under another name? That's the promise people have been chasing for decades, but the reality has been one legal dead end after another. Have you ever had the answer to a problem sitting right in front of you, but red tape kept you from grabbing it? That's exactly what has happened here. The idea seems simple. Take DNA from the bones in Billy's supposed grave in Fort Sumner. Compare it with DNA from living relatives of his mother, Catherine McCarty. If the remains match, the official story holds true. If they don't, then the survival theories gain powerful new support. In practice, though, the plan has run into roadblocks at every turn. Start with the grave itself. Billy's supposed resting place was never clearly marked. Over the years, floods from the Pecos River washed over the cemetery, scattering bones and destroying early markers. When a headstone was finally put in place years later, it was little more than a guess. To this day, no one can say with certainty that the remains beneath that marker belonged to Billy the Kid. Digging them up might not even produce the right body. Imagine the headlines if the famous grave turned out empty or held the wrong man entirely. Then there's the legal fight. In the early 2000s, Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan and a group of supporters pushed for exhumation and testing. They even wanted to dig up Billy's mother's grave in Silver City to secure a firm DNA sample. The courts said no. Family descendants objected, local officials resisted, and judges ruled against disturbing the graves. Respect for the dead, tribal land issues. and fear of endless lawsuits all weighed against the effort. The science was ready, but the law slammed the door shut. Meanwhile, the survival theories refused to fade. Supporters of Brushy Bill Roberts argued that if DNA could be taken from his grave in Texas, it could prove once and for all whether he was Billy. But that too ran into legal and logistical problems. Families didn't want the graves disturbed, and no court wanted to open the floodgates to every wild outlaw claim. Even when samples were gathered, questions about chain of custody, contamination, and proper comparison methods left the results useless in the eyes of science. Controversy also swirls around Garrett's own story. Some theorists argue that if DNA testing proved Billy wasn't in Fort Sumner, it would tarnish Garrett's reputation forever. His book, his career, and his legacy all depended on that one night in 1881. Do you think powerful local voices might prefer the mystery unsolved, rather than risk rewriting the history books? It wouldn't be the first time politics outweighed truth. Another problem is simple but maddening. There is no universally agreed set of living relatives to test against. Billy's brother Joseph died young, and family lines grew scattered and thin. Genealogists have traced cousins and distant descendants of Catherine McCarty, but disputes over accuracy keep piling up. Without a rock-solid chain of kinship, even a clean DNA result could be challenged. It would answer nothing if lawyers could argue the sample wasn't really from Billy's bloodline. All of this means we remain trapped in limbo. The tools of modern science could solve the mystery tomorrow, but the legal walls are higher than the scientific ones. Historians, descendants, and local communities all pull in different directions, and the courts have decided it's safer to leave the bones where they lie. As a result, the most famous outlaw in the West remains unconfirmed in his own grave. So where does that leave us? On one hand, the official story is still the strongest. Billy the Kid died at Fort Sumner in 1881, shot by Pat Garrett. On the other hand, the survival theories still breathe because the one test that could prove everything has never been done. That gap keeps Brushy Bill Roberts and other claimants alive in the imagination, even decades after their own deaths. Here's the clear take. DNA science could have ended the debate years ago, but legal fights, family objections, and poor grave records have left us with no definitive answer. Until someone manages to untangle the courts and the history, Billy the Kid will remain in the twilight zone between fact and legend. Maybe that's why his story still grips us, because it was never fully closed. And so we come to the end of this journey. We've traced his shadowy origins, weighed the kill count, marveled at his escapes, explored his bond with Pat Garrett, questioned his death, followed his supposed survival, and seen how even modern science cannot settle the case. Billy the Kid lives on, not because of what he surely did, but because of what we can never quite prove, and that may be the most fitting legacy of all.